Welcome to Inside Auto Podcast, where we feature everyone and anyone you'd want to talk to in and out of the automotive industry.
Ilana Shabtai here, host of Inside Auto Podcast, where we interview top dealers, GMs, marketers, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders in and out of the automotive industry. Unfortunately, my co-host, Aaron Horace, can't make it today because he's at Digital Dealer. So for those listening, Digital Dealer, booth 315, you can go stop by. And we have a really special guest today. So before we introduce today's guest, let me just quickly go through. This episode is sponsored by AutoLeadStar.com. The AutoLeadStar platform is built on a technology so powerful, it allows you to market, sell, and service cars as you would in the real world at scale and online, making one-to-one matches between shoppers and inventory. AutoLeadStar is the only platform that is powered by scale, speed, and specificity to change the way dealers do marketing today. All right, now let's get into it. We are in season 3. This is episode 2 of season 3. Again, very special guest, Ibrahim Mesbah. Nice to have you on today, Ibrahim.
Thank you, Elena, and really nice to be here with you. So,
awesome. Well, let me give you the proper intro you deserve. Ibrahim is the founder of RevolutionParts, an e-commerce solution that helps dealers transform the way parts buyers and sellers connect. Before the founding of RevolutionParts in 2013, Ibrahim worked in software development for both Intertel and PayPal. Now he's on a mission to disrupt and innovate the automotive space, which we all are, right? Creating the most active parts network in North America, and has led RevolutionParts to over 1,500 customers with over $1 billion in parts and accessory sales, which is extremely impressive. I don't know so much this side of the business, so I'm excited to hear about it from you, learn about it. So before we begin, and today is kind of a special episode because we're going to talk to, he's also, of course, a Dealer Marketing Expert Panelist. So we're going to dive into one of his recent articles. But before we do that, let us know, how did you get into automotive? How did you get into the parts business? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. So, like you mentioned before, founding RevolutionParts in actually 2014.
My mistake.
Worked at PayPal with, my co-founder Andreas. We're both engineers by trade and spent over 5 years there. PayPal was an eBay company, and it was a great place to work. We learned a ton about e-commerce, payments, marketplaces, and grew a huge passion for that. And one of our friends ran a parts department at a local dealership here in Phoenix called Showcase Honda. And, always talked about how hard it was for him to really run an online business selling Honda parts. So it opened our eyes to an opportunity. What we saw was there was a lot of solutions in the marketplace that were severely lacking. So we felt that the industry was underserved. And the more we researched it, we were really convinced that we could take our huge passion for e-commerce and payments and take that and have a big impact in a huge industry, right? And automotive. So it's been over 7 years now, and just honestly fell completely in love with the industry. I think there's still a ton of opportunity to really transform that experience, create a lot of value, and do what we're really passionate about in just a really big space. So that's how it all got started.
Yeah, and I love that. I really like hearing the stories specifically of people who worked in very successful technology companies outside of automotive and try to bring that innovation inside of automotive, because we all know automotive is 10, 15 years behind every other space. And actually on that, I'd love to know what do you think, especially coming from outside of automotive tech, even if you worked within the automotive tech sector at PayPal, for example, you're still based on, outside of automotive tech. What was one of the biggest challenges for you to break into the industry, or the biggest discrepancy that you saw from outside of automotive to inside automotive?
There's a lot of moats, right, to really breaking into automotive, and it starts with data, right? So essentially what we do is we do e-commerce for parts, right, to help dealerships sell more parts and serve their customer better. And access to that data is really hard. Access to inventory is really hard, right? You have to go through all these big integrations with all these DMS providers, or rely on the customer to manually download and upload their inventory. So we've made a lot of progress over the years, but access to data still remains one of the biggest issues. And I know the better data and the more data we get, the more we can really build a much better experience that's going to convert even more, right? So I think that's been the number one challenge, is really garnering the right relationships, negotiating the right deals so that we have more access to both data, pricing, and inventory.
I think that's a really important point. And even though you've successfully figured out how to get around it, I think in general, the industry has to prioritize more accessible data, whether that's open APIs or, giving the dealer more control of their data, whatever that looks like. And I think it's probably a mix of everything. I 100% agree. And I think the industry can do a lot more with data because right now it's super siloed. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, and I'm sure we can have a big discussion about that. But can't agree more. And I think when you look at the industry, definitely access to, let's say, new car inventory data is a lot more accessible, right? Because that's traditionally been the biggest focus, right? Still is. So it's a ton harder on the part side. But I'm seeing movement on that front over the years. I've definitely seen more openness to share data, and things are getting more competitive, especially when you look at the aftermarket, right, where data is so much more accessible. So, right. But yes, no, absolutely agree there.
Wonderful. So let's, and this actually has a connection to your recent article in Dealer Marketing. As I mentioned, you are a Dealer Marketing Expert Panelist. And if you haven't checked out Ibrahim's content, you can find it on dealermarketing.com. But one of his recent pieces was what dealers want from their OEM programs. And the reason why I specifically reached out and wanted to talk about this on the podcast is, one, I like talking about controversial things on Inside Auto Podcast. I think it's important that we talk about it. And I don't think we talk enough about the OEM program structure. I think it's a little obsolete. I think it's not necessarily based on performance metrics anymore. There's a lot of bureaucracy involved. Of course, when you think about tier one, you have to have those guidelines, understandable. But I think there's a lot of work to be done around OEM programs, and you know better than I do, as you proved out here in this article. So let's talk about it a little bit. Break down some of the points, and we can start with just one or two that you think are most important to dealers right now. And I know you also put out a survey. Tell us a little bit about that process and the responses that you got, so that we can have a discussion here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we sent a survey and targeted a lot of general managers, and really wanted to ask questions about essentially where they felt the OEM programs could be better, how they were being received, were they delivering on the value. But there was also a lot of focus on the parts side, right? So GMs focusing on, what we found is most of the programs are actually in parts and service, which was interesting and we didn't really quite expect.
Yeah.
And we sent it to, I think we sent it to over 1,000 GMs, and we got a lot better responses than we expected. So we have over 250 people responded. So there's definitely a lot of passion and a lot of interest on the topic. And, we found that a lot of the GMs wanted to really share and hoping to get this out there so that we could really start a discussion and see if we can partner with our OEMs and really help address some of those points, right? Mm-hmm. But the key points come, I think just starting from the top, is one, better support, right, from the OEM. So better communication up front about the structure of the program, the why and the how. Better support in terms of like co-op dollars or ad spend dollars or training, right? Training was a big theme. Mm-hmm. And then solutions that really work. So think about the customer and customer experience. Is it growing their sales? Is it improving efficiency, right? Is it delivering on the value? So those were kind of like the three themes that that came up over and over again. So we had a few graphs and we tried to like look at the data and combine it in different ways. But I would sum it up in those three different areas, right? Better communication, programs that are easier to use, structure, training, support, and experience.
Yeah, and I think let's talk a little bit about like the co-op aspect and the cost, just because I think that also influences a lot of it, and that can even fall under training in a bit, just because there's so many questions around co-op and breaking down what they're going to get reimbursed and what they're not and what's allowed. So if you want to elaborate a bit on that as well, if you had any responses on that, I'm not sure if you included that in your survey, but I'd love to hear about that as well, because even from the vendor side, I'd love training on that. Like,
Yeah.
there's so much that we need to learn.
Yeah. So when you take e-commerce, and I think a lot of our questions around e-commerce touch on this a bit, right? So it's a pretty competitive market, right? So you're competing not just against other dealers, but really more against the aftermarket, right? Mm-hmm. And when you look at total sales online, the OEMs there's maybe $4 billion in OEM parts sold online. Right, versus almost over 20 billion, right? So the rest is all aftermarket, right? And there's just online sales, part sales. So there's definitely a big gap there, and we believe we can close that gap. So how can the OEM program support the dealers in being more effective at competing? So, and the OEMs do this on the collision side, wholesale collision. There's a lot of pricing programs that help close that price gap and make the OEM parts more closer when it comes to price parity, right? But on the co-op side too, right? Marketing dollars, right? Could the OEM help co-op either the program fees and or a big part of the marketing dollars if the dealer is able to show that we're able to deliver a good return on every dollar spent, right? So that the money's not used. So I think there's an opportunity to really structure these these programs with co-op if the value's there, right? So that the money is not wasted, and it should be a win-win both for the OEM because they have higher margins on those parts and the dealer, right? Because it will allow them to be more competitive, market better, and grow their online sales.
Yeah, and it's interesting that this does really go back to the data point too, because dealers have an upper hand against the aftermarket if the person bought the car from them and they're a customer within their database. And if that data was able to be leveraged in their marketing, which OEMs would then support with co-op, they would really be in a different place. So I think this goes hand in hand with a lot of what we spoke about as some of the challenges in the industry, but also just different ways that OEMs can really help dealers in these programs. And you're right, the aftermarket, I hadn't even really thought about it, but the aftermarket is a whole different ballgame in terms of competition. And so they really need that upper hand. They really need to be able to leverage that upper hand that they have, and that customer journey and the customer data so that they can actually create that experience for shoppers. So we'll get there. And the last thing that I wanted to touch on a bit more is the success of other dealers using this program. I'm not sure exactly if that's something that the OEMs would share, but are there programs, and this also can even fall under training, but are there benchmarks in place or like best practices or things that dealers can access to understand their performance, and or do they have choice to move to different programs if they want, or are they locked in? Again, not sure if your survey touched on that, but I'd love to know your opinion on that.
Survey didn't really go touch on that, right? But yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the category, right? So in general, let's say you want to be part of a program for your dealership website and really marketing your new car inventory, right? There's a lot of players in that space and there's a lot of choice, right? So typically I would say yes, there is choice. I think, touching on performance, right? How are the dealers doing and what do they need to do to be more successful and how do they compare in their region maybe? I know, from the OEM programs that we do have, we do share a lot of that data back to the OEM, but I think there's definitely an opportunity to share that back with the dealer and make it very actionable so that they could, change whatever they need to change to be more competitive, more successful, get more value out of it, right? So we don't see that part of it as much because that's probably between the OEM and their regional reps and the dealer. But we're going to be focusing more there to really serve up at least what we see in our product, right? And just to drive that behavior and really awareness, right?
Yeah, I think that's great that you guys are initiating that. And if this all, again, connectivity, being able to connect the dots, whether that's through data or through performance results, market share, whatever it might be, I think that's pretty much the common theme here, especially for such a big industry. I mean, it's a small industry, but there's a lot of money in the industry, and it should be used well. So I love that you wrote about this. It opened my eyes to a lot of holes that dealers see in the automotive OEM programs, and I always see it through the vendor lens. So it was nice to see it that way. And thank you for sharing the survey results. Do you have any surveys coming up? Because you have a great reach.
Yeah. No, we probably do. I mean, we do these maybe once a quarter, so I don't have the topic off the top of my head, but I would ask you to just follow us, and our marketing team's pretty active on our blog, on social media, and there's usually teasers out there before they go out.
That's great. Yes, please do follow. Anything that you want to share with our listeners before we sign off here?
Yeah, we didn't really touch on experience very much, but I think it's an important point. And this is right. What we see in a lot of OEM programs is they're really structured with a lot of controls that might be OEM friendly, but they're not end customer friendly. Mm-hmm. So we try to work really hard when we structure our OEM programs with the OEMs to make sure that, all right, if this is supposed to work and deliver a lot of value, we need to really focus on the end customer's experience. So it's always a balancing act, right? Like, how far do you go? Are we structuring this to work great for the dealer or the OEM and really compromise the experience? Or do you want, right? So we're trying to move that pendulum, because it's all, as you know, today, it is very competitive and it's all about the experience, right? So it's a pretty key point, and dealers see it. Like, as part of our survey that came up again and again, there's a lot of legacy programs out there where the experience really hasn't kept up with the service levels that our customer today is expecting, right?
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up. I know that was a big part of this article as well. I'll say two things on that. The first is that customer experience absolutely has to be priority. I agree with you. But the last thing that you said there, I want to point out, because I think I want to emphasize that I think it's something that we often forget when we think about the customer experience, which is that consumer habits change, especially when they go through things like a global pandemic or an inventory shortage. And so not only does it have to be emphasized on the customer experience, but it absolutely has to be flexible, and you have to be able to adapt. So thank you so much for bringing that up, because I think that is critical for any program, OEM programs. I know that was a big part of the article as well, so thank you for bringing that up. Anyone who has not seen the article, please head over to Dealer Marketing Magazine. Expert panelists are great. There are tons in there that we'll bring onto the podcast and that we've had on the podcast. But Ibrahim, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure to spend some time with you, Elena.
Yes, you as well. For our listeners, if you like this episode, please tune in and subscribe Inside Auto Podcast. We'll catch you next time. And Ibrahim, please follow Expert Panelist on Dealer Marketing. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Inside Auto Podcast. Check out our other episodes with top entrepreneurs and industry leaders.